You guys ready to get started? You got audio on me, Kevin? Okay, good. All right. All right, so everybody has a handout tonight. We're taking a break from our study on discernment because Andy's recovering, like we prayed for a minute ago, from his procedure on his esophagus. So he's going to take at least this week off. We'll see how he's doing next week. And so I thought that I would do something that's at least fun for me, maybe not for you. I don't know. I thought it'd be fun to take tonight and talk about some things that I'm working on and writing on in my dissertation, because it's on my mind. This is currently what I've been writing on this week, and so I want to see if I can make it interesting to you. If I can't make it interesting, that's a problem for me, and I've got to get better at it. All right. So I have some passages that I want you guys to have ready. Somebody be ready to read from Genesis 3. Anybody who wants to volunteer to do that in a moment, okay? And then Genesis 12. Anybody want to grab that one? Anybody? Cold. And then Genesis 22. I'll give you the verses are on your paper. Okay, Caleb. And then Matthew chapter 1. Who can have? Okay, Lisa's got Matthew chapter 1. All right. So I titled this Matthew's, and this is not a word that I expect you to know, Matthew's Toledot. I don't expect you to know it because it's not English. It's a Hebrew word. But it's a Hebrew word that occurs a number of times in the book of Genesis. And the reason that it's important is it introduces new sections of the book of Genesis. So, they didn't have chapter divisions and verse divisions originally. So there's got to be some kind of signal for the reader to know, when am I starting a new section in this book? Because Genesis is a fairly long book. And it's not just randomly thrown together stories. Moses wrote it in a really, really artful way. And he's marked out the major sections of his book with this word, Toledot, which is normally translated something like generations or genealogies or something along those lines in your English Bibles. And the way that these are laid out, they mark out 5 major sections in the book of Genesis. We're not going to look at all of those, but I thought it might be fun to look at the first 2 because they're relevant to what we're talking about tonight. All right? So we're going to look at the first time we see these markers for when does a new section, a new major section in the book of Genesis begin. So open up in your Bible to Genesis chapter 2. You would think that you might find this in Genesis chapter 1 to mark the beginning of the first chapter. But Genesis chapter 1 all the way down through chapter 2 verse 3 is really kind of like an introduction. It really is. And then starting in Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, we have what you might call the first major section of the book of Genesis. So Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 says, these are the generations. And there it is. There's that word, generations. And that phrase, these are the generations, is the phrase, the whole phrase, is typically what marks these major sections in the book of Genesis. Now, it's interesting that it doesn't give you a genealogy after that, which, because of that English translation, you might expect a genealogy. And you do get those a lot of times. But not here. Instead, you get a story. The story of the Garden of Eden, the creation of man, and then the creation of Eve, and in the first marriage. All of that falls under this first section. And then it continues on. The story of the fall in Genesis chapter 3. The story of Adam and Eve's first children in Genesis chapter 4. And then when you get to Genesis chapter 5, you finally get another one. Genesis chapter 5, if you look at it, verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. And then you do get, just a few verses later, a couple of verses later, you get the beginning of, a genealogy throughout chapter 5. Now, what's the difference? Did you notice a difference between Genesis 2:4 and Genesis 2:5? Did anybody notice a difference? Well, one just says these are the generations, right? And that's the way it's usually written. That's the normal form of this phrase. But 5:1 says this is the book of the generations of Adam. And so there, it's a little bit different. Just remember that. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. I'm not going to say anything about it now, but just remember it. So that means that from chapter 2, verse 4, down to the very last verse of chapter 4, that's a major section in the book of Genesis. And really, the chapter divisions are pretty good here. They're not always really good, but they're pretty good. Because Genesis chapter 2 is the first third of that story, and everything is good and harmonious in the Garden of Eden. Genesis chapter 3 gives us the story of the fall, the entrance of sin into the world, and God's initial judgment upon the serpent and the man and the woman. And then Genesis chapter 4 shows us at the very beginning, what does this new fallen world kind of look like? What are things going to look like now outside the garden, now that sin has entered into the garden? So you get before sin, the entrance of sin, and then after sin in this first big section of the book of Genesis. That's really important because that puts Genesis chapter 3 at the middle of this first section. And at the very middle and the center of Genesis chapter 3 are verses 14 through 19. So if we really want to get at what's the main point of this section, chapters 2, 3, and 4, what's the main point? What are we supposed to get out of this? I mean, there's a lot of things to get out of it. There's a lot of information that we learn there. But what's the biggest idea? What's the central idea that we're supposed to get? Well, it's in Genesis 3, 14 through 19. So who had that? Who had Genesis 3, 14 through 19? Somebody? Okay, go ahead and read that for us. Sure, go ahead. It should have. So the first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 2 should really be in chapter 1. And Genesis chapter 2 should start with verse 4. But when the chapter divisions were added, not all of them were put in the right spots. Not all of them were put in the most logical places. So, those are added in the medieval period. I know more about the addition of chapter and verse divisions in the New Testament than I do the Old Testament. So I'm not sure who added the chapter divisions in the Old Testament. There are markers in the Hebrew Bible that are usually, quite often, different than our chapter markers for divisions, but they're not numbered markers. They're just a little letter off to the side that says, "Hey, a new section starts here." But why they put the chapters where they are, I don't know. A lot of times they're in the right spot. Like you saw 5:1, that makes sense. But I don't know why they're where they are. The Septuagint doesn't have the same chapter divisions that we have. They come later. Septuagint's really early. So the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, comes even before the New Testament. So it's a good question. Wish I had a better answer. All right. Okay, thanks. So these are the curses. This is the judgment that comes in light of the entrance of sin into the world. The heaviest of those curses, of those judgments, the only one that's actually called a curse, really, in terms of the individuals involved, the earth is cursed, but the serpent receives the curse, and he receives the harshest of all of them. And first, he's told things like, you're going to go on your belly, you're going to eat dust, and those are phrases that indicate his humiliation, right? Actually, literally describing the way it looks like a snake moves on its belly. They don't actually eat dust, but, they're in the ground always with dust, around them. So, but these are, when you find these phrases later in the Old Testament, eating dust or going on one's belly or being prostrate on the ground, they're always indications of humiliation. And so that's the beginning of the judgment, is this kind of humiliation on the serpent, who we know from the New Testament is the devil himself. And then he moves in verse 15 to what we would call the first gospel, or is often called the first gospel, or it's actually written and spelled in a few different ways, but this is how I do it. The proto-evangelium. Proto being first, and this is gospel, good news. So the earliest announcement of the gospel, the first gospel, that's verse 15, where we read, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And it's really important to pay attention to the words there that it says he and his. Did you notice that? Because offspring could refer to one particular individual, or it could refer to a whole lot of people. But because the pronouns are singular and masculine, what we're being told here is that at some point in the future, a child is going to be born of a woman, and that child will both be attacked by the serpent, and he himself will respond and deliver a death blow to the serpent. That the serpent will strike at him, and he will strike the serpent. He'll strike the serpent on its head, which kills it, but the serpent will strike him on his heel. And some people have said, well, getting, just on the heel means he's just going to be wounded and hurt. But I think it's worse than that, because if a serpent strikes you, it doesn't really matter where it bites you. In the most common places, if you're bitten on the ankle or the foot, and you're, particularly in the ancient world, you're probably going to die. So I think in both ways, we're looking at these death blows that are going to be delivered. One upon the serpent, and then one upon this offspring, literally seed of the woman, who's going to come. And then there are other curses that are here. We find that the relationship between the woman and the man will be strained, and that she will encounter pain in childbirth. And then for the man, the very ground that he is supposed to work to provide food is going to fight against him. It's going to yield thorns and thistles. And so you have these aspects of the curse involving childbirth, bearing children. The very thing necessary for this future deliverer to come is going to be hard and difficult. And then the man's work and labor of providing is going to be really difficult for him. And the ground itself is cursed and will fight against him. Noticing all of those things is important, because when you move through Genesis is really written to help you to try to track that initial promise of a future seed. But it's also written to help you track and follow along with the seed of the serpent. You wonder, well, we can see who the seed of the woman is, but what is the seed of the serpent? What does that mean? And when you read through Genesis, what you find out is that the seed of the serpent primarily are human beings who attack and fight against the seed of the woman. Because the seed of the woman is, yes, an individual in the future, but until you get to that future, you have all of these other offspring, the line, the family line that leads all the way up to him. And Genesis traces for us the enmity, the fighting between these two seeds. But Genesis also tells us that eventually this promised seed, this promised offspring will come into the world, and when he does, he will reverse the curse. He will fix everything that goes wrong in Genesis chapter 3. And that's not just something we have to move all the way into the New Testament to find. You don't have to leave Genesis to find that information. It's not in chapter 3. We're just promised that there is a future offspring of the woman who will crush the serpent's head. But this idea of him reversing the curse and overcoming all of the enemies of God's people, and even of bringing salvation to the whole world, it's right there in Genesis. You don't have to move outside of Genesis. And we start to see it in Genesis chapter 12. Who had Genesis chapter 12? All right. Okay. So, the calling of Abram and the initial promise of a future blessing, both upon Abram, but then through him to all the families of the earth. So there we have the inclusion of all of these other people groups, all of these other families. But when you continue to read, even in chapter 12, when you continue to read, it becomes really clear that this blessing that's going to go to all the families of the earth, it's going to come through a descendant of Abraham. Even when you just get down to chapter 12, verse 7, where the land is promised to Abraham, it's promised to him and to his offspring or to his seed. So that the reversing of the curse, of at least two elements of the curse, are found here. On the one hand, you have the need to overcome difficulties in childbirth, right? That's a theme that keeps popping up in Genesis, is women who struggle with childbirth. And we've already been told in chapter 11, at the end of chapter 11, that Abram's wife, Sarah, is barren. She can't have children. So in order for him to have offspring, her own barrenness, which is an expression of the curse of Genesis chapter 3, is going to have to be overcome. It has to be. That's not the final, ultimate overcoming, but it's this initial kind of, hey, this is going to happen, even in a small way to kick things off and get them going. And then if he's going to receive this land, and ultimately this land, when the Israelites dwell in the land, they're going to set up a temple. They even do this in the wilderness before they get to the land. They set up a tabernacle and later a temple. And God dwells and walks among his people in the midst of the temple, just like he did in the garden. Just like he did. And just as in the garden, when they're cast out, you have angels guarding, cherubim guarding the entrance into the garden. So in the temple, which is the center of the life in the land, what is it that's built over the ark? Cherubim, right? So all this imagery is telling us, all of this stuff is telling us that the promises made to Abraham about future offspring and about inheriting the land are signals that what happened in Genesis chapter 3 is going to begin to be fixed. Now, that's not the fixing of it, right? But that's helping us to follow along in the story and see, yes, God means what he says. And we're getting an expansion. Before, all we had was this offspring of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent. Now, there's a tie between the difficulty the woman has in giving birth and the land itself. Those are both tied to the offspring. Now, when you read this through the story of Abraham, though, most of the time the offspring of Abraham refers to Israel or to his children, to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It refers to the whole lot of them, the whole group of them, most of the time, but not all of the time. One of the things that we get a glimpse of in a few places in Genesis is that while there is a plural, multiple offspring of Abraham, the people of Israel, there is also within Israel the promise of an individual once again. We can't walk through all of that in Genesis tonight, or it would take all of our time. But I want to look at least one spot, okay? Because in Genesis chapter 22, you can see Israel as the collective offspring, seed, right alongside of the promise of a future one, who, by the way, will defeat his enemies and will bring blessing to the earth. So who did I give Genesis 22 to? Okay, just read those two verses.
17 and 18.
Uh-huh.
I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall be all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice.
Okay. So the first time we see offspring, it's referring to Israel, right? I mean, numerous offspring. That's Israel. But then the next time we see it, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. So God's going to multiply Abraham's offspring, but at some point in the future, there will be an individual offspring from that line who will defeat his enemies, possess their gates, take over, enter the city. And not only that, but in this offspring, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That takes you back to chapter 12, right? So now we know when chapter 12 says, in you, Abram, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now we know from chapter 22 that happens through this individual future offspring, the future seed who will come. So the seed of the woman is narrowed down now to the seed of Abraham, right? Because all human beings are descended from Eve. So the seed could come from anywhere, but it's narrowed down to Abraham. And as you keep reading in the story, it keeps getting narrowed down. The other major place where it's narrowed down is with David. With Abraham, God makes a covenant, and a part of that covenant is the promise of the offspring. And then later with David, God makes a covenant, and as a part of that covenant is that he will have an offspring who will sit on his throne forever. So keep all of that stuff in mind. All of that is just background. Okay? Now we get to some of the good stuff. Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Did I have someone open to Matthew 1? Will you just, to start us with, will you just read verse 1?
This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, son of David, the son of Abraham.
Okay. This is the genealogy. Is that, it doesn't say this is the book of the genealogy or the record in your, okay. So a more literal translation would be, this is the book of the genealogy, or the word here is the Greek equivalent to the word Toledot. And as it turns out, it's actually the word Genesis. Now, by the time that Matthew is writing his gospel, the book of Genesis in Greek is already known as Genesis. So it's not accidental on Matthew's part, right? He's calling to mind the whole story of the book of Genesis by using this. But he uses the exact language of Genesis 5:1. There, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Here, this is the book of the generations of Jesus Christ. And how is he identified? Son of David, son of Abraham. The two major narrowings of the seed promise in the Old Testament, right? Abraham and David. And then we get a genealogy, just like we get in Genesis chapter 5. But this genealogy is a little bit different. All of the genealogies in Genesis start with the main focus, and then they move forward from them. So if it says this is the genealogy of Adam, you're going to get Adam's descendants. Okay? Not his ancestors. But with Jesus, it's the exact opposite. This is the genealogy of Jesus, but you don't get descendants of Jesus. It's reversed. Instead, you get his ancestors. That's really interesting. There's one other time that the word Genesis occurs in Matthew chapter 1. It's in verse 18, which, interestingly enough, in the Gospel of Matthew is the beginning of the next section. Okay? So do you mind reading verse 18?
This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit.
Okay. The word birth, that's how most of our English translations render it. It's the most logical way to render it. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But in the original language in which Matthew wrote his gospel, it's the word Genesis again. So, this is the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then the Genesis of Jesus Christ took place in this way. So what's happening is Matthew, in these two places, is telling us, look back. Look back to the opening of Genesis. But what's really interesting to me is that there's a consistent pattern in Genesis. When you get these Toledot statements, these division markers, these are the generations of, they go like this. When you look at the major ones, they go like this. Toledot statement, then a story. Toledot statement, then a genealogy. Toledot statement, story. So it goes back and forth between story, then genealogy. Story, then genealogy. That's the order in Genesis, that all of these major sections, it's how they work. Matthew does the opposite, doesn't he? Matthew says this is the book of the generations, and then he gives you a genealogy. Matthew says the genesis of Jesus Christ took place in this way, and then he gives you a story. He reverses it. One of the things that Matthew does throughout his gospel is he turns things on their head. He reverses things. There are a lot of places where this happens, where Jesus does the exact opposite of something that occurred in the Old Testament, for instance. A good example is the temptations in the wilderness. Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years, tempted and failed. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted, but he succeeds, right? There's all of these reversals in the Gospel of Matthew. And what we're seeing at the very beginning is that for those who know the book of Genesis really, really well, they're going to notice two reversals all of a sudden. One is, instead of getting story, genealogy, you get genealogy, story. The other one is that instead of getting this is the book of, or this is the genealogy and then this is the book of, they're switched. First you get this is the book of, and then you get a simpler statement of the Genesis was this way, or thus. So you're getting these reversals in the opening of Matthew. Again, if Matthew's wanting us to really, really think about Genesis, then I think what he's doing is he's wanting us to think about the reversals. That the promises made to Abraham, carried forward through Abraham's descendants throughout Genesis, the seed promise, that goes all the way back to Genesis 3:15, is aimed at reversing everything that went wrong. That's the point of it. And Matthew is helping us to see that he's about to tell the story of how that's going to happen. That's the story he's introducing. Now, what about this business of the promise of Abraham being that all the families of the earth would be blessed, or in chapter 22, all the nations of the earth would be blessed through Abraham's seed in chapter 22? What about that? Do we see that in Matthew chapter 1? Yeah, we do see it. There are 4 women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. 4 women. And if Matthew's already drawing our attention back to the promise of the seed of the woman, then we should probably pay attention to the women in the genealogy. It's unusual for women to appear in ancient genealogies. Read the genealogies of the Old Testament. You'll find rarely do women appear there. And yet there are 4 women, not counting Mary, okay? There are 4 women in the genealogy of Jesus. Can you spot them? Ruth. Rahab. Tamar. Other than Mary. This one's harder to see because it doesn't give her name. It just says the wife of Uriah. Oh. Yeah, it doesn't say her name though. There's a reason for that too. But what do these 4 women, aside from the fact that they're all a part of Jesus' genealogy, what do they have in common? They're all Gentiles. All of them. Now, Bathsheba may not have been a Gentile, but by marrying Uriah the Hittite, she's counted as a Gentile, and Matthew makes us see that by not saying her name. Bathsheba is Hebrew, the name itself. So, by not using her name and just highlighting, she's, by the way, wife of Uriah, the Hittite, he's highlighting that all of these women are regarded as Gentiles. So if he wants us to see that the seed who will bless all the nations of the earth, the seed of the woman, has arrived in Jesus, and he's beginning the work of reversing the curse, what better way to do that than to include these 4 Gentile women in his genealogy? That takes us all the way to the end of Matthew, to the Great Commission. So that what we get with Matthew at the very beginning, with these Gentile women, and then he emphasizes it again with the wise men, Gentiles who come to worship the king, even while the Jewish king is trying to kill him, right? He emphasizes it there. He emphasizes it several times. But then he gets back to nations in the Great Commission, where the disciples are commanded to go and make disciples of all the nations. So that one of Matthew's main points, even though Matthew is a very Jewish gospel, you don't catch on to any of this stuff that I'm talking about unless you know Genesis really well. It's a really Jewish gospel. It is really rooted in the Old Testament. But despite that, Matthew wants any Jewish readers of his who are reading this gospel to see and understand that the Messiah came into the world to do what God said to Father Abraham in the beginning, to bless all the nations. He's the one who's going to make all of that happen. Now, why would this kind of stuff matter? Because I'm not even getting into all the really technical arguments for these things. I'm just kind of laying it out for you. Why would this sort of thing matter, and why would I want to spend my time trying to find these things, trying to notice these things? Well, it really comes down to some things that Jesus himself said. This is why it matters. In Matthew chapter 5, we covered this already in our sermon series on Matthew. Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Jesus came to fulfill all of the Old Testament. The commandments, yes, but also all the promises and prophecies. If you go to the Gospel of John, though, John really shows Jesus bringing this point home. John chapter 5. I'll read this. I didn't hand it out to anybody. John chapter 5. Jesus says, we'll jump all the way down to the really good part. In John chapter 5, Jesus talks about his own testimony. I can't see well with my glasses on. He says, "The testimony that I have is greater than that of John," verse 30, 6, I think. For the works that the Father has given to me to accomplish, the very works that I'm doing, bear witness about me, that the Father has sent me. And the Father who has sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you've never heard, his form you've never seen, and you do not have his word abiding in you. It's a strange thing to say to the Jewish religious leaders, right? And then he says, you search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. And it is they that bear witness about me. Jesus says the Scriptures bear witness about me. But he gets even more specific than that. Go down to the end of chapter 5, starting in verse 45. Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you. Moses. Moses, the writer of Genesis, right? Moses, on whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? Jesus says, Moses wrote about me. It really matters that we see the ways in which the Old Testament, even starting as early as Genesis, it matters that we see the ways in which the Old Testament look forward to and predict the coming of Jesus. It matters a lot. And all of the promises that we find about the future Redeemer, the future Messiah, all of them really track back to Genesis 3:15. All of them. All the business about the offspring of Abraham goes back to Genesis 3:15. All the hope that the Jewish people have had for centuries about a king from the line of David, the promise to David of a future seed tracks back to Genesis 3:15. All of it does. We need to learn to read the Old Testament the way that Jesus read the Old Testament. And when Jesus read the Old Testament, he saw it as a book about him. Even the law, even the books of Moses. The Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, is not mainly a book with a lot of commandments in it. It's not. It's a book that mainly looks forward to the future Messiah. Even before they've started using the term Messiah, the Torah looks forward to the Messiah. So, if it's true, what Jesus says is true, that Moses wrote about him, then it's helpful for us to begin to recognize some of the places where he did that. So that's why I think it's important to do these kind of studies, because we confirm the reality that Jesus speaks of in the Gospels. All right, we have about 5 minutes for questions. Greg.
Something I was thinking about this genealogy, Adam was the first Adam, right? The natural.
Mm-hmm.
And the genealogy starts from him and goes down, right?
Right.
Well, in the case of Jesus, I realize it's turned the other way, but where does it start? Abraham, the man of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, it begins, well, and you have the son of David, son of Abraham. So he starts with Abraham, but he emphasizes David throughout the genealogy. He tracks from Abraham up to David, and then from David down to the exile, and then from the exile down to Jesus. And every time there, he's emphasizing David repeatedly throughout the whole thing.
And another thing, in Genesis 3, it talks about the seed of the woman,
Right.
meaning it's a virgin, right?
Yeah, I think when you get to that part of Matthew chapter 1, I think Matthew's understanding, he's saying that this is an unusual birth, and he can uniquely be called the seed of the woman.
So when you get into Matthew, after the genealogy, he starts out showing Mary was a virgin.
Yeah.
So it's a fulfillment.
Yeah, and it's a fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14, which is a prophecy about a virgin conceiving and bearing a child. And in that section of Isaiah, it's all about looking ahead to a future hope beyond Israel's current troubles. So it's really important, yeah.
You can really see how Matthew is showing how everything in the Old Testament is fulfilled.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so Adam's genealogy is his descendants. Jesus' genealogy is his ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it goes any other way because, Adam was the first. He's going to procreate. Jesus isn't going to have children.
Right.
We would have children, right? So you had a parallel of that being that the book has other reversals. I guess I missed some of your point on that. Can you
Yeah. Well, so it's not just, the only one we read was Genesis 5, but all of the genealogies in Genesis are introduced with, these are the generations of, okay? And all of them, so if it says these are the generations of Noah, you're not going to get a record of Noah's ancestors. You're going to get his descendants. And that's consistent every time.
Well, I would think that would be common, though, because we're not the same as Jesus, right? I mean,
So with that phrase, what you would normally expect when you see that phrase would be a list of descendants. But he's using it in the exact opposite way here to give the ancestry of Jesus. So it's that phrase that's key, not the fact that there's a genealogy. Jesus couldn't have any other kind of genealogy because he doesn't marry and have children. It's not the fact that there's a genealogy, it's that he borrows that phrase, which occurs throughout Genesis, and every time it introduces descendants, not ancestors. And that it's a very prominent, important phrase in Genesis. He's not plucking something obscure out of Genesis. It's the phrase that marks all the major divisions of Genesis. So that's why I think what he's doing is he's reversing what would be normally expected. Normally you see that phrase, these are the generations of Jesus. The normal thing to come after that would be a list of descendants, which you can't have with Jesus. Right? So he could have said, this is the genealogy of Abraham, and tracked it down to Jesus, and that would have fit the normal pattern. But he didn't do that. And so Matthew has a number of those reversals. The only one that I mentioned was where he reverses when Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days as opposed to Israel's 40 years. Israel failed. Jesus reverses that and succeeds. And so there are a number of those different reversals happening in Matthew.
Can you think of the other reversals off the top of your head? You got the 40 days, 40 years. Was there another example?
I'm just looking in early in Matthew right now. Some of the other reversals off the top of my head, can I do it? Maybe not right now. I've got a list of them sitting on my desk, but yeah. Yeah, no, yeah. Any other questions, comments?
It's interesting to think, like, in our culture, like, we don't notice this type of stuff, but they would have noticed it because they were learning. I mean, like, what, at age 12 you were already reciting most of the
Oh,
Old
yeah.
Testament? So they would have noticed that pattern if they were shown the gospel.
Yeah. And there are still cultures today, mainly oral cultures, but there are still cultures today that place a lot of value on genealogies, even though ours doesn't, and it always reads as boring and weird to us, and we like to skip over it. The Jewish culture, at that time at least, in the ancient world, it mattered a lot. And there are still cultures today to whom genealogies really matter. That if you're going to prove that you're somebody, you've got to give your family history. You have to. And so Matthew's writing to a culture that values that. If Jesus is going to be taken seriously in that culture, he's got to show that he has the pedigree, which is what he's doing right here at the beginning. Luke has a genealogy, but Luke records his genealogy for an entirely different reason. Right? He has a genealogy of Jesus. He goes all the way back to Adam, and he goes from Adam to Jesus. Or from Jesus to Adam, excuse me. He does it backwards, and he has an entirely different purpose than Matthew does, because Luke's largely writing to a Gentile audience. So he's doing something different. But Matthew, he's showing the pedigree of Jesus. Judy?
Is it significant to the Jewish mind or to God's plan that when Israel was destroyed, that all the records of genealogies and everything where they really don't know who they came from? And does that mean anything? I mean, is that something to talk to the Jewish people?
Yeah, I mean, it matters that most of those records were lost. It might help. Yeah, it might. I don't know how that would go in a conversation. I don't know. I've never had that conversation. So,
I just wondered if it was like, this is the end here. This is
Yeah.
the true beginning.
yeah. I don't know. Anything else? Or, yeah.
You mentioned the reversal, like the reversal of structure being symbolic of the reversal of the curse. Was that the, like, I guess, technically speaking, the fulfillment of kind of a prophecy, or was it actually like there's a standing curse that was reversed?
So I think it's the fulfillment of the promises in Genesis 12, which are then worked out and expanded upon throughout Genesis. And so I think it is the fulfillment of that. Yeah, which comes as a kind of prophetic promise. That this is what I'm going to do, Abram. Yeah. All right. I'm going to close this in prayer because we got to get kids, some of us. And then you can still ask more questions and stuff if you want. We can hang out. So, Father, I thank you for letting us spend a little bit of time looking at some ways in which Jesus fulfills the promises of the Old Testament. I thank you that there are so many things, some far more obvious than some of the things that we're looking at here tonight. So many ways, so many indications in the New Testament of how Jesus really and truly does fulfill all the hopes, that all the promises that you've made are yes in him. And I pray that the more we see of that, the more we would long to worship Jesus for who he is. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.